There are several age-related diseases that affect the cardiovascular system. And in order to study and talk about these diseases, we first need to understand a little bit about how the cardiovascular system works. And so the overall function of the cardiovascular system is to transport blood via the heart, arteries, and veins. And so kind of like any fluid transport system, the cardiovascular system is a series of tubes, specifically arteries and veins, that conduct a fluid, which is your blood, to a target tissue. And like any fluid transport system, it requires some kind of pump to move the fluid. And in this case, the cardiovascular system's pump is the heart. And so if we look at the pathway of blood from the heart, we can actually see oxygenated blood in red and deoxygenated blood in blue. Deoxygenated blood comes into the heart from the body via veins, which move towards the heart, comes into the right atrium, moves down into the right ventricle, and is pumped to the lungs to pick up oxygen. Once that blood has been oxygenated, it comes back to the heart, into the left atrium, and then is pumped out of the left ventricle to the rest of the body. And that oxygenated blood moves away from the heart in arteries. It's able to convey that oxygenated blood to the target tissues, and once oxygen has been dropped off here, that blood needs to return to the heart to go pick up more oxygen in the lungs, right? And so it returns via veins back to the right atrium, and the whole thing continues again. And so, as I said, arteries move blood away from the heart. The A in arteries and the A in away can help you remember that. And arteries are actually have much thicker walls than veins do. And that's because they contain more smooth muscle than veins do, an additional structure that helps deal with the pressure generated by the heart. Because you can imagine that as the heart pumps, it pumps with enough pressure to pump the blood all the way from your heart to the tips of your fingers and toes. So arteries need to be thicker walled and stronger in order to deal with that pressure. Arteries also can contract and dilate to help control blood pressure. And that happens through changes to the smooth muscle of the arteries. And so if that smooth muscle contracts or relaxes, it can change the blood flow in the artery. And usually the blood flow in arteries, as I said, is maintained by a constant pressure generated by the heart. And so blood flows relatively easily in arteries. Whereas veins require a little bit extra in order to move blood back to the heart. Because you can imagine that in the arteries as the pressure from the heart pushes this blood forward. But by the time the blood reaches a target tissue, potentially like at the tips of your toes or fingers, there's not very much pressure left. And you can actually see that change in pressure in this chart down here. And therefore, the blood still needs to get back to the heart, right? It needs to get back there so it can reoxygenate and then oxygenate other tissues. And so in order to get that blood back to the heart, veins have evolved several different mechanisms to kind of keep blood flowing in this direction. One of which is by utilizing the movement of skeletal muscles around veins to sort of generate some pressure and push the blood through. And there's also the presence of valves, which you can see here in the veins. V for valve, V for vein. Valves don't exist in the arteries because they're not necessary. But what valves can do in the veins is they can actually allow blood to flow through to a certain point and then stop. The valve will close behind it, and then the blood can flow to the next valve, and that valve will close behind it, and it kind of keeps blood moving through the veins without the use of contraction and dilation. And so, as I mentioned on the previous slide, both the heart and the arteries make use of muscle contraction, whether it's cardiac muscle in the heart or smooth muscle in the blood vessels, to generate blood pressure and to generate the flow of blood to tissues. And so in terms of the heart, contraction of the cardiac muscle or heart muscle is mainly under control of neurons. or under neural control. There are nerves that stimulate the heart muscle cells to produce an action potential, and that generates contraction of the cardiac muscle, and the heart will pump, generating blood flow to the tissues that need it. Arteries can also use muscle contraction to generate blood pressure and flow, but in the case of arteries, most of the control of contraction of the smooth muscle that makes up the walls of these arteries is actually controlled by hormones or other kind of local conditions. And you can see some of the conditions, either hormones in the case of epinephrine and epinephrine, or norepinephrine, or some kind of local controls like changing oxygen levels that control what happens to muscle contraction in the arteries. And so when arteries contract, that's known as vasoconstriction. And a contraction of this smooth muscle decreases the diameter of the artery. And so you can see here a normal artery and then a nice cross section below. During vasoconstriction, the smooth muscle ends up taking up a lot more of the diameter available inside of the blood vessel. And that decrease in diameter increases the pressure, or increases blood pressure. And as a result, kind of slows down the flow. The opposite would be considered called vasodilation, where the smooth muscle in an artery relaxes. You can see it takes up less of the diameter of the blood vessel as a whole. Now this luminal space, or this empty space in the blood vessel, gets bigger, the diameter of the artery gets larger, and blood pressure goes down, and blood flow increases. And so you can see here some normal vasodilators and constrictors that affect blood flow in the arteries. And I'll focus on two. Right, so epinephrine and norepinephrine have opposing effects. Epinephrine is sometimes called adrenaline, and it exerts hormonal control on the blood vessels. And it's actually a vasodilator, which means it does this to your artery. It makes the diameter wider, it increases the flow of blood, and it lowers blood pressure. And that's important, right? Because when adrenaline is working, we need blood to flow to our tissues, because adrenaline signals that fight or flight response. And so if there's a lot of epinephrine or adrenaline, it's probably a good idea that your blood vessels are dilating and the blood can get to the tissues where it needs to go. And then in order to reverse that effect, norepinephrine or noradrenaline works as a vasoconstrictor. And that means it decreases the diameter of the arteries by causing contraction of that smooth muscle. This increases blood pressure and slows down the flow of blood. And so you no longer need blood flow to these particular tissues when your fight or flight response is over, and norepinephrine can kind of counteract those effects of epinephrine. And another way that the heart can actually adjust the amount of blood pressure and flow is by adjusting what's called the cardiac output. And so cardiac output is simply the amount of blood that the heart pumps out into the circulation. And it can be defined by a particular equation, which you can see here. Its cardiac output is equal to the stroke volume times the heart rate. And in sort of more normal terms, that means that cardiac output is equal to the amount of blood pumped with each heartbeat, which is the stroke volume, times the number of heartbeats per minute, or heart rate. Right? And that kind of makes sense, right? So the amount of blood your heart can put out is the amount of blood pumped with each heartbeat times the number of heartbeats per minute. And so cardiac output, and really what determines it, is the body's needs for for oxygenated blood. And the way that the body senses how much oxygenated blood it needs is by taking into account this thing called venous return. Venous means veins, right? And so what venous return is how much deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart from the veins. And that determines how much need there is for the heart to pump out oxygenated blood to replace that venous return. And so usually cardiac output matches the venous return. And you can adjust the heart kind of makes some adjustments in order to adjust its cardiac output and match the body's needs. And two things that are important in this are compliance and contractility. And so compliance is basically a measure of how easily a certain structure can expand under pressure. And when we're talking about cardiac output, what we're really focusing on is the compliance of the heart chambers, right? So a structure like the heart chambers needs to have a certain amount of compliance so that it can expand and fill with blood in order to respond to needs. And the more compliant these tissues are, the more blood that can fill up the chambers of the heart, and therefore the more blood that can be pumped with each heartbeat, or the higher the stroke volume. And contractility, or the ability of the heart muscles to actually generate force, is important as well in determining cardiac output. And so it's important that the muscles of the heart have a high ability to do this, right? A high contractility, so that they can squeeze and eject all of this necessary blood into the circulation. And so there has to be a balance between compliance, which is how much blood those chambers of the heart can hold, and contractility, because there actually is sort of a diminishing return. And so you can see here, according to this Frank-Starling mechanism, that there's only a certain level of stroke volume that the heart can really achieve before it starts to affect the ultimate cardiac output. And that's because once the heart's chamber stretches too far or tries to fill with too much blood and pump that blood with each heartbeat, there's not enough contractility to actually generate force on such a large chamber. And so the contractility can't match the compliance at certain high stroke volumes, and that can actually just lead to a leveling out of cardiac output. So there's sort of a limit on what the cardiac output can be. There's only so much you can push the barriers of a structure before you can't actually generate enough force in the heart to pump the blood. Right? And so generally, the more venous return there is, or the more blood coming back to the heart, the greater the contractility, right? Because you need more blood to accommodate this intense venous return. And so you increase the ability of your muscles to generate force. And unfortunately, you can only do that, as I said, up until a point, right? And that point is determined by the compliance of the heart muscle cells and works according to this Frank-Starling mechanism.